Hello, everyone. I am Javier. He's the UDDC tournament for Africa. Welcome to all the participants and all the debaters for this workshop, very interesting, with our specialists, Tshiamo Malatji. And welcome, everybody want to learn with us. This video, this workshop will be uploaded in our YouTube channel, and we are so proud to have you here, Tshiamo. Thank you for your present, for be here. Sorry for my English, and we wish you have a good workshop and teach you a lot of things to prepare this tournament. So all the screen to you. And we start with Tshiamo Malatji introducing two advanced speakers.
Okay, thank you so much for the introduction, Javier. So we're going to start the workshop quite shortly. Um, the important thing about this entire thing we're doing at UDDC is I think it's really opening up and expanding debate in Africa. The presentation I'm going to be giving is called a SEMA speaker training session, and I've actually made an accompanying booklet, which I'll also distribute. And what I've done is I've designed a booklet that is mobile friendly, so you can actually check it out on your mobile device and share it through messaging apps like WhatsApp. Just to wait a moment there, Javier and everyone else, so we can just get ourselves started on the internal Discord server, and then we'll start the training session immediately.
Sorry, repeat me, Tshiamo, please.
Hi there, Javier.
We are waiting, Shannon. Okay.
Okay. Okay, so I just want to get confirmation in Discord that everyone can hear me. Hi there, everyone in Discord. Okay, great. We're set up on the internal server. I'm going to start with a training session. There won't be any accompanying slides, but I will make the booklet available for everyone to go through afterward. There's quite a lot of text in the document, so I'm not going to put a lot of text up on the screen. I'm going to cover three things in today's training session. The first I'm going to do is to revisit burdens. I know that for a lot of debaters, burdens is seen as a very simple idea, as something that's usually involved in basic training. But I think that mastering the basics is what it means to be an advanced speaker. So we're going to return to burdens. Secondly, I'm going to look at some principles. I know that the predominant belief is that principle based debating isn't necessarily that successful. We're going to look at a few principles that you can implement in debates with some examples. And then finally, I'm going to do a little bit of evidence seeking. We're going to look at how you can use creative examples in a debate, even if you're debating something that you have very little knowledge of. Okay, so let's start with this first one on burdens, the first section. Here we're going to visit four burdens. Some of these you'll remember from basic training. Some of these are things that every debater should be doing in every debate. The first burden we're going to look into is a burden of applicability. The question here is to find out whether or not the idea that you're presenting is applicable to the debate. Question: does it apply to this debate? So, general ideas don't always apply to very specific cases. The logic of a general idea is this applies generally enough to create a trend, but you can't necessarily always apply general trends to very specific cases. In debating, it's quite common for us to look at general ideas and theories like broken window theory or government mandate and make the case for why these generally exist, but we don't always go so far as to show why that theory pertains to the current debate. So, with broken windows theory, the common idea that community deterioration invites crime might be true in general, but it's still important to show why it would apply in a specific community or the specific debate that you're having. You can mention examples of general principles to embolden your case, but you still need to prove that it applies in this specific context. So, how do you do this? The first thing you have to do is explain what makes up the general rule that you're speaking of. What comprises it? What are its factors? And then after that, you have to show why those factors apply in this debate. Basically, you're showing that the debate is made up of the same factors as the general principle that you're using to analyze the debate. So let's use an example. The tragedy of the commons refers to when a shared resource is overconsumed at the expense of a group because individuals in that group are incentivized to consume and they can't be excluded from consuming. It's already a popular general idea used frequently in debating, but you still have to show its application. You do this by explaining in detail what factors cause this economic problem and how the conclusions of the debate have the same factors. This includes analyzing cause, behavior, incentives, and trends. A very common example of the tragedy of the commons is the use up of environmental resources. That's, I think, one of the most famous examples of the tragedy of the commons. So that's just what the principle is in general. And I think it's widely accepted that the tragedy of commons exists. It's a widely accepted economic problem. But now let's give the debate. The motion is this House regrets opt in carbon emission regulations. So basically, an opt in carbon emission regulation means that a government might ask its businesses to choose what carbon emission regulations they want, or maybe like the Paris Accord, you might have countries that choose their targets for reducing carbon emissions, but they obviously aren't forced to. There's nothing that they'll be punished if they don't do it. None of that applies. So it's entirely opt in. Okay, so the proposing team or the government team can argue that opt in regulations do not force exclusion. Remember, the tragedy of the commons exists because you can't exclude anyone. So the first parallel they might make is that an opt in regulation doesn't necessarily exclude anyone from the resource. Because there's no measures for recourse, it means that consumers, governments, businesses aren't deterred. There's nothing that's stopping these people from continuing to consume these resources. A lot of the early adopters adopt on goodwill, and the goodwill of these early adopters may erode or lessen when the consumption of non adopters continues. So the people who do opt in to these regulations might stop opting in when they realize that other people aren't opting in. One factor of the tragedy of the commons could be analyzed as people using resources at a high level, particularly because other people are using it at a high level. So, opt in regulations, because not everyone abides by them, can be self defeating because the people who originally opt in want to opt out when they realize that other people aren't opting in. Example, US pulls out of the Paris Accord, just as an example. The proposition team can actually continue and say that even if some countries continue to adopt these regulations on carbon emissions and they never stop, there's still going to be a tragedy of the common scenario between the remaining consumers. Because all the countries that don't opt into the resolution are still consuming at high levels, which will still be overconsumption, leading to the depletion of that resource, which is still a tragedy of the commons. So basically, the tragedy of the commons still exists, even though there are less players in the game, in other words. So that's what a proposition can argue. What you've done here is you explain the general factors of the tragedy of the commons. The fact that you can't exclude anyone, the fact that there's no deterrence from consuming, the fact that other people are consuming at high rates, so that makes you want to consume at high rates. And then you look at how, in this case, with opt in regulations, none of these factors change. Therefore, tragedy of the commons continues. Each point can be further strengthened by explaining it even more and by providing examples. But the opposition can do the exact same thing. And in this case, I argue they might even be able to do it better. The opposition can argue that a factor of the tragedy of the commons is the lack of self moderation. So everyone that's consuming resources isn't moderating their own use of that resource. So there is no self moderation. So they can actually go on to say that opt in regulations provide self regulation and self moderation of resources, which is not present in the tragedy of the commons scenario. So self imposed regulations have something that a tragedy of the commons does not. Furthermore, there are alternative resources like renewable energies that are encouraged in order to meet the demand. So countries still have high energy demand because they have carbon emission regulations. They need to meet these demand in alternative ways. So they're more likely to develop solar energy, natural gases, various forms of providing energy, mostly through renewable means. We've moved away from nuclear though, um, in order for them to meet that energy demand. And so they make these regulations easier to abide by because they're developing their alternatives. Okay, so here it is. You need to meet your energy demand, so you develop alternatives. Now, because you've developed those alternatives, you have less of an interest to go back to carbon emission based energy. So basically, opt in regulations assist in making people want to maintain their opt in regulations, if that makes sense. So, adopters of this regulation now have an incentive to continue developing alternatives. This is especially true given the competitive advantage that early adopters will have in alternative energy industries. So, if I'm really good at making solar panels or photo electric cells, for instance, if I become the country that's best at doing that, when other countries start to move towards solar energy, I have a competitive advantage, and I'm set to make a lot of money off that trade, or the corporations in my country at least. And so, early adopters of carbon emission reductions that do develop alternative energy have an incentive to develop that alternative energy. Um, what does this mean for the debate, and what does this mean for tragedy of the commons? Is it means that there is another incentive in play here. With the tragedy of the commons, the incentive might be greed, the incentive might be to use up as much of the resources as you can. But with opt in regulations, you can argue that it creates the incentive to develop alternatives. And so, this new incentive to create alternatives counteracts the incentive to just be greedy and use up carbon resources. Does that make sense? So, you're showing that the factors that make up the tragedy of the commons don't make up the same kind of factors of opt in regulations. So effectively, opposition will argue that the tragedy of the commons is actually averted by opt in regulations. In this debate, both teams are trying to show that you're still going to have a tragedy of the commons. The proposition by saying that you can't exclude people, that there's still incentives to consume, that people are still consuming at a high level, show links to tragedy of the commons. The opposition showing that self moderation already means there's no tragedy of the commons, that we're going to be developing alternatives means that the incentive to just consume greedily is not going to be there. Finally, the opposition can even show that whoever does not adopt the carbon emission regulations will probably consume less of the resource because they're competing with fewer other people, especially if the larger countries in the world are the ones implementing carbon emission regulations. So the tragedy of the commons is therefore averted. So the basic principle here is I've got this general principle, and I think we all know a lot of the general principles in debating, but you have to show that it applies very specifically within the debate that you're talking about. And you do this by looking at the factors that make up the general principle, what factors make up your debate, and showing that those factors are similar enough. So, what makes up the general principle has to also make up the debate, is a nice way to put it. So, who wins this first burden of applicability? The team that wins this is the team that explains the general concept and how that concept applies in this specific debate. It's all in how it's explained. Often, some ideas become so widely accepted that people are generally aware of them, but showing that it applies or does not apply in a specific debate is still a burden on each team. It helps to be comparative here. Explain the differences in how your team explained the concept and why your explanation is more accurate and why your case for applicability is more likely to be true. So that's the first one. The first burden here is show that this applies. Some people call this relevance, but it's more specific about looking at the general ideas that we tend to use in debating, that we use a lot, and making sure that it actually applies in this specific debate. Because I think it's fairly easy for an opposing team to just make the rebuttal that all the time you've spent explaining your general principle is irrelevant because it doesn't apply in this debate. Now imagine spending a lot of time explaining the tragedy of the commons, but not explaining why it actually applies in a specific debate about opting carbon emissions, for example. That was the first burden. The second burden I'm going to deal with is something I like to call accuracy. So the question here is this the right way to say this? Am I getting across what I am intending to get across? Am I communicating effectively? Unfortunately, language use is an important part of communication. So, attempting to be accurate in how you explain ideas is useful for communicating those ideas more effectively. Now, especially for English second language and English foreign language speakers, accuracy is not about vocabulary. It's about effective communication of an idea. Often, this is linked to word choice. Words, even synonyms, have different connotations and interpreted meanings. What I recommend for any speaker is to think about more accurate words to describe or explain a concept or the idea they're trying to bring about. They should write down those keywords choices down and make sure that they use those phrases a few times in their explanation in order to reinforce those words in the debate. So let's ask this question of is this right? Let's try explain something. Let's explain the gambler's fallacy. It refers to the mistaken belief that prior results necessarily influence the likelihood of following events. For example, a coin toss has two probable outcomes, heads or tails. The probability of each event is 1 out of 2, 50%. If I toss the coin and I get 10 consecutive heads, it does not mean that tails is more likely to be tossed next. The probability of heads or tails is always 1 out of 2, regardless of previous events. So that's quite simple. Gambler's fallacy, mistaken belief that previous events influence the probability of next events. There is an inaccurate way to describe this exact same fallacy. If I just said that the gambler's fallacy refers to the fact that prior results don't influence the likelihood of following events, then I'm not explaining the fallacy at all. I'm just giving a fact about probability. The fallacy is actually the mistaken belief in the fact that future events are dictated by previous ones. So, although one can do well to explain in detail how the probability of a coin toss does not depend on previous results, you've actually just spent time explaining probability, not the fallacy, which is about a fault in reasoning. So, there's a difference. If we're trying to show people that someone made a mistake, positioning that person as someone at fault by explaining how mistaken they were is more convincing than just explaining how things ought to be. Like explaining how coin tosses work, for example. The second case of just explaining how coin tosses work doesn't mention the actor or their mistaken belief. It's less accurate and less convincing. So, this is actually a common mistake made in debates a lot. In this example, you spend a lot of time explaining a concept, maybe why corruption is bad, but you don't spend a lot of time explaining why it is that particular people commit corruption or why or what motivates them. Is it greed? Is it a lack of accountability? Is it self-interest? Explaining what motivates an actor to be corrupt makes it easier for us to believe that they should be held accountable than just explaining what corruption is, if that makes sense. So you're being more accurate in the first case where you're involving the actor than in the second case where you're just speaking about the deed itself. That is, of course, if you're in a debate about holding the actor accountable. What you say can be true in general, but not necessarily true to what you're trying to convey in the debate. Let's look at a motion example. The motion is this house regrets philanthropy. If you're on government or proposition, you may want to conclude that philanthropy is harmful. Philanthropy is basically the act uh, of wealthier people or corporations giving out money or aid to particular causes. Okay, so you might want to show that this is harmful, its benefits are outweighed, or it creates the conditions for less wealth accountability. You could explain philanthropy as short term aid by stating that wealthy donors are not incentivized to make consistent payments over a longer period of time than what meets their interests or media attention. You could also call it delayed aid, given that many foundations spend their money much later rather than sooner, and that when they make an announcement of the funds they're going to spend, they do it much earlier than that money is actually spent. Again, probably for public attention and media coverage. You could also say that it's special interest aid, given that the donors decide who gets funded, and usually this aligns with the beliefs of the donor, so their special interests. You could call it vanity aid, which makes explicit the claim that donors are attracted by public attention and applaud for their supposed philanthropy. So, by using phrases like short term aid, delayed aid, special interest aid, vanity aid, you're actually kind of reinforcing the arguments that you're also making in the debate. Rather than just calling it aid, for example, you're being more accurate to the kind of message that you actually want to convey. And now it's important to not just use these key accuracy terms. You can't just call it short term aid or call it vanity aid. You need to actually explain it. Because if you don't do this, a term without an argument is just jargon or rhetoric. An argument without an accurate term is less effective. Both together is convincing. Now, lying or misframing an idea or squirreling is a bad strategy because it can be easily called out. That's not what I'm advocating. Accurate descriptions that are also fair to the debate can and should be well explained. Trying to make one's speech more effective doesn't mean your speech should be less honest, but being honest doesn't mean that you should be less effective. So my recommendation is, as you're doing your prep for your debate, think about some key phrases that will really help you explain the concept that you're trying to convey in ways that are more accurate. So how do you win this point of accuracy? A good checklist is to ask how accurate you've actually been about specific parts of an idea that you've analyzed in your debate. Ultimately, you need to go over key phrases and review if they're communicating what you want them to. Make sure there's a connection between what you're trying to prove and the language that you're using to prove it. Use careful note taking to help you find more accurate keywords. Don't worry about sounding smart or debater like, and focus more on simply being effective. It helps that you think about what you're saying and also think about what you've just said. So as you're speaking, think, oh, I've just said this. This is accurate. I can use that term. Or think, oh no, I haven't used the terms that I want to describe. One thing I like to do is I like to write down keywords or phrases down on my page next to the argument, and as I'm speaking, I just reference back to those keywords to make sure I actually use it. It will really help with debating more effectively. The third burden I want to speak about now is importance. It's asking the question, does this idea matter? It helps to say out loud why your idea is important to the debate, what strategic value it gives your team, and why it helps you win. Judges won't always interpret the importance of the idea that you present to them. The material that you present in a debate is called matter, and I think that's no coincidence. It has to matter. What you say needs to be important for evaluating the debate. If it's not relevant or it's marginal, it won't heavily impact the debate. Your content won't always be credited to just by giving it out. It could be interpreted differently than you intended. Its value in responding to other ideas in the debate might be neglected. That's why, after presenting your idea, sometimes show the damage that it's done. So, let's give an example. In order to find and eliminate criminal behavior, this is a motion I'm going into. This is a info slide, basically. In order to find and eliminate criminal behavior, law enforcement are allowed to engage in sting operations whereby they create circumstances that allow individuals to take criminal actions that they can then be arrested and prosecuted for. Sting operate. Okay, this is not entrapment. Entrapment is a different case where you're intimidated to commit a crime you otherwise wouldn't have committed. A sting operation just means that you're given opportunity. So entrapment is illegal. Sting operations are still legal. um, Police are allowed to set up sting operations to catch criminals. Okay, so the motion is this House would ban sting operations. So proposers can argue that sting operations are more effective at catching easier to catch criminals, as evidenced by the fact that evasive criminals still evade police despite the use of sting operations. More than this, police are incentivized to catch whoever they can catch to create the perception of police competency and public safety. This results in less competent crime committers being more likely to be caught. These are also more likely to be more vulnerable, less educated people, which also shift the proportion of successfully caught criminals to marginalized demographics, which in turn can create harmful perceptions that relate crime to these demographics. So, quite basically, the prop argument here is the police will use sting operations to catch the low lying fruits, the easiest people to catch. Also, look at the types of crime that sting operations usually target. These are crimes such as burglary. They're easier and they're less costly to catch with sting operations. And they're also the types of crimes that are more likely to be committed by people of marginalized demographics. This has the same effect of swinging the perceived proportion of committed crimes to marginalized people. Sting operations don't even disincentivize the kind of crime that they catch because the factors that cause a lot of crime are socio-economic, and the people committing them are coerced by the environment and lack of positive alternative choices. In fact, the over-policing of marginalized groups can incentivize less action to address underlying factors that cause crime because it looks like they're actually doing something, and that means that criminal actions will simply continue. A proposing team can continue by arguing that when sting operations are banned, it will force governments to actually address crime systemically in order to retain public trust and appear effective. This means that wealthier criminals are more likely to be sought for their white collar crimes, and socio-economic programs to prevent crime will be more likely implemented. Moreover, catching more evasive criminals of any demographic is more likely to be the police's focus. So this is obviously a strong claim. It mentions marginalized communities, so it's also a very strong appeal. And opposition doesn't want to come across like they don't care about marginalized communities. They don't want to just ignore that analysis as if it wasn't presented. So what the task of an opposition team to do is to try and respond to the strong appeal in a way that is effective, which means that they need to give value to whatever their response is. So after they set their response, they need to say, oh, this was the value of that response. And this serves the purpose of making sure that judges understand the value of what they're saying against very strong emotional appeals from a government, which kind of inherently has strong value. Okay. The first response from the opposition should be to undermine the role of sting operations in over policing marginalized communities and the demographic profiling of crime. The opposing team can argue that profiling is actually the consequence of bias in police departments, and this bias will be filtered into any practice of the police, whether it is responding to protests or making arrests. The fact that sting operations are biased is not a consequence of sting operations, but rather the police itself. They can go on to say the value of this argument is it shows the proposing team will not address the bias by ending sting operations, that the proposing team has erred in its explanation of police bias, and this alone cannot determine whether a policy of sting operations as a general police practice should continue. Like other general police practices, like making arrests or responding to protests, these are general practices which can also be prone to bias, but that doesn't mean that these other general practices should be stopped. So they can also go on to say the bias will continue. And given that the proposing team is banning sting operations precisely because of that bias, it might create the perception they've done something against the bias when they actually haven't. The value of this response is it shows that the proposing team's arguments are self defeating and might actually worsen attention given to police bias. So, what I'm doing here is I'm not only making the argument, I'm showing what value that argument has for my strategy in the debate and for me eventually winning the debate. A second response from the opposing team may be to just suggest that police departments are likely to become more overtly biased. If true that police will need to gin up more public perception of safety, they are likely to police more publicly then, especially in communities where the perception of crime exists. More than this, if police can't catch people through sting operations, they're likely to push for more invasive policies like stop and frisk, stand your ground, citizens arrest, and greater surveillance. The criminal justice system might harshen punishments to appear more active. In fact, the response of the government might be to become tougher on the easier to catch because they are still easier to catch. The value of this response is that it shows the unintended harms of the proposer's policy idea. It extends from the proposition's own analysis that the police target easy to catch criminals and do so specifically for public perception of effectiveness. Banning sting operations doesn't change these conditions. And without sting operations, these conditions can create a far worse justice system. So you see what I've done there? Again, I've explained the argument, then I've shown the value of the argument. By valuing their responses, opposition has made it easier for a judge to understand their reasons for opposing the proposing team, and especially that they are not against addressing police bias. Moreover, even after very powerful claims from the proposing team, it's clear how irrelevant these claims were to the motion, specifically about sting operations. The valuing did not only show why the opposing team's responses mattered, it also showed why the proposing team's original points did not. So, how do you win this point of importance? The reality is, not all matter is important. Teams need to show how irrelevant or the lack of value is present in other teams' ideas. It may feel a bit mean to do this, but it's important to prevent judges from overvaluing the contributions of other teams. Always apply value relative to other teams' ideas. If you're just stating why your points are important, it won't communicate why the other team's points should be valued less in order for you to win. Don't just apply value for the sake of it. Ending your every single point with the value of the statement is can seem repetitive and non genuine. It's crucial to reserve this in cases where judges are likely to overvalue your opponent's ideas or undervalue your ideas. Okay, so the final burden I'm going to speak about here is to show validity. The question here is, does the conclusion follow from the points that I've made, the premises that I've used to build this conclusion? The ideas that you use to build your argument are what result in your conclusion. I'm sure from basic training you've already seen a simple premise structure. We call that a valid argument. It's helpful to show these steps explicitly, even if your conclusion is widely accepted. So let's firstly revisit quickly valid arguments. In formal terms of logic, an argument is the combination of premises to create a conclusion. For example, my first idea can be that everyone over the age of 18 can vote. My second idea is to say that I am over the age of 18. My conclusion, obviously, therefore I can vote. I'm allowed to vote. This structure is simple enough, but in debating, we don't speak in structure form, obviously. This also means someone might just say the phrase, I'm over 18, so I can vote, and it's implicitly understood that the phrase anyone over 18 can vote is hidden there in the argument. But relying on implicit understandings might work in that example, but it's a bad strategy that doesn't always work out well. It's best to be more explicit with your arguments. You don't have to necessarily phrase it in argument structure in the debate, but it helps to mention how you get to your conclusion. Let's look at an example. Uh, Sorry, before we get there, you certainly won't win a debate just because you show that your arguments are valid, and sometimes you might even win with invalid arguments. But because usually debates are actually meant to be judged on the soundness of cases, but sometimes conclusions can be so widely accepted that we don't always expect the premises to be generated. But a lack of focus on showing how your argument is valid means that judges might have to ascertain the implicit links for themselves or other teams for that matter, and that always won't always be what you intend. Let's look at an example. The motion is this House would ban government bailouts to large corporations. If a proposing team simply says that a guarantee of bailout means that corporations act more recklessly, and then they provide some examples and case studies, they could be addressing a strong point with immense real world evidence. It's unlikely that a judge or an opposing team will even disagree with them. And it's unlikely that an opposing team's strategy, given all the real world evidence, would be to just refute the claim as false. But without explicitly explaining how they arrived at the conclusion that corporations will act recklessly, they technically have not shown why or how their argument is valid. What an opposition can simply do is exploit that failure by filling in the argument for the proposing team in a way that does still lead to the conclusion, but is more charitable to the opposition. So basically, you don't disagree with what the proposition is saying, but you're going to create an argument structure for your team that makes it easier to rebut what they're saying simply because they didn't provide the argument structure. So let's look at an example of an argument structure in this debate that an opposition can exploit. As the first premise, they might say that corporations spend recklessly when they are protected from risks. Secondly, they can say that corporations are protected from risks due to government bailouts. The conclusion here is therefore corporations spend recklessly due to government bailouts, and they've built the entire thing around risks. Remember, the proposition simply said they'll act recklessly. Now, the opposition is agreeing they'll act recklessly, but saying the reason for this is simply because of risks. Okay, this is a valid argument. It's probably not what the proposition was saying explicitly, but since the proposition didn't provide this argument structure, an opposition can hijack it, as long as they maintain the same conclusion. Now the opposition can argue that the real problem is just that bailouts are no risk. The counter solution by the opposition could be to create conditions for bailouts which do create some level of risk, such as partial government ownership of the company. They could further argue that partial government ownership of the company is a significant risk for a company that will be included in their calculations of whether to spend recklessly or not. Now, the valid argument for the proposing team is helpful for creating an effective counter solution for the opposing team. So, to backtrack, remember, proposition said they spend recklessly. Now, opposition saying, yeah, they spend recklessly, but because there's no risks. So, if we just add some risks to the government bailout, they won't spend recklessly. So, the problem isn't the bailout itself, it's the risks attached to it. And so, because proposition didn't do enough to explain their argument structure, opposition can explain it for them, exploit that, and still develop the same conclusion, but then develop a different counter prop. Okay, but what if the proposing team had actually stated their argument structure? It would have been more difficult for an opposition to argue a counter solution. Instead, the proposing team might have said something like this: one, government bailouts guarantee the replacement of capital. And so, one, government bailouts guarantee the replacement of capital. Two, a guarantee for the replacement of capital causes corporations to act more recklessly. The conclusion here is, therefore, government bailouts cause corporations to act more recklessly. That's a very different structure here. They're saying that it's not the risk that's causing these corporations to act recklessly, it's the guarantee of replacement capital. And so, by framing the entire debate more around replacement capital than risk, it's more difficult for an opposition's response to simply be, let's mitigate the risks. Because the crux now of the case is the fact that the replacement capital will still be there. So, do you see like a different argument structure from prop makes it more difficult for op to exploit the argument structure? Even if the fact that corporations will act recklessly is generally accepted, The way in which you go about explaining it can be different and can vary. And if you don't explain it explicitly, an opposition will just exploit that to explain it in ways that are more favorable to them. Now the argument structure is less about risk and is more about certainty. Corporations are certain about the future and so are more opposed to be risk to act riskily. This is also a more general explanation of corporate recklessness because the only reason, perhaps, that corporations feel protected from risk is because they're certain about the future. Certainly, opposition can obviously still argue their counter solution about how partial government ownership can act as a counter incentive, but it won't be as easy as it was before when proposition didn't provide an argument structure. So it's important to reveal the steps in logic that you're making so that those steps aren't filled by an opposing team or by a judge to your own detriment. So, how do you not lose this point? If your ideas are easily misinterpreted or straw personed or just misunderstood, it could be because some of the steps in your argument were silent and implicit. Perhaps teams or judge believed that you just got to your conclusion else how. That's why it's important to be explicit about how you actually arrived at your conclusion so that it can't be exploited. Even if you're sharing what might seem obvious, it's preferable to overshare than to be straw personed. Note your general argument structure down so that when you're speaking, you can make sure that you've said all the necessary steps. Okay, so that's how. So those are the four burdens that I spoke about. Just to just go over this first section that I spoke about. The first burden is to ask whether something applies in a debate. The second is to ask whether or not you're describing it in the most accurate way. The third is to ask if what you're talking about is actually important. And the fourth is to actually uh, make sure that you've actually shown the logic, how you got to your conclusions. Now, when you put these four things like that, they all sound like very basic burdens that everyone should be doing. And mastering these burdens is actually something that any advanced speaker should do. Okay, so I know it's quite a lengthy workshop, but we're going to move now onto the second section where I'm going to cover principles. Okay, we're going to look at a few principles here, mostly some examples. This part of the workshop will go a lot quicker. Okay, the first principle we're going to look at is something I'm going to subtitle Take It, Make It a Law. Immanuel Kant argued that people's principles are moral if they would want everyone to espouse that same principle. A moral action is therefore one that we want everyone to commit to. If we took an action and made it universal, would we want that action? A principle that allows someone to lie to get out of trouble could be considered immoral because when universalized, we don't want everyone lying to get out of trouble. On the reverse, we would likely want everyone to tell the truth. So telling the truth can be considered moral. And thus, we have laws in society. It's a punishable offense to lie under oath, but it's not punishable to tell the truth under oath. We don't want a criminal justice system where people under oath lie, so there's a principled reason to punish offenders for lying here. An important part of this principle is to remove it from the personal beliefs of a person that they have about a certain action. A person can for themselves support lying, but not support everyone doing it. So let's look at some debate specific examples. A debate about decriminalizing an activity can rely on this principle. For instance, someone may be okay with hate speech when they're using it, but they might not be okay with everyone using hate speech, especially against themselves. More generally, is a society of everyone using hate speech a society we consider moral and desirable? It can be argued not, and therefore the regulation of hate speech can be defended on this principle. Another debate relevant example is the decriminalization of recreational drugs. Sure, we might not want everyone taking drugs, but a better way of phrasing this principle is to ask whether everyone should be restricted from their preferred recreational activities. Is that a society we want to live in? In the second case, the way the argument is structured and phrased is important. The claim is not to say, do we want to live in a society where everyone takes drugs? Yes, therefore taking drugs is moral. What we're saying is, do we want to live in a society where no one is allowed to pursue recreational activities, of which in this case drugs is an example of. And we might say that that is an immoral society. And so drugs should be decriminalized, not for the sake of drugs themselves, but for the sake of recreational activities, if that makes sense. When using this claim, it's important to fully first explain the idea and this principle. I mean, it's important to first fully explain the principle and then explain how it applies. So, first, explain the general rule about how activity should be considered moral or immoral, and then argue why a particular action is immoral. Note that in the recreational drugs debate, the actor committing the immoral action was the government, and the motivation for decriminalizing was to stop this supposed immoral action. This argument isn't even about the drugs themselves. It's all about requiring laws to be universal. So that's some examples of how to implement this principle in debates. Second principle, I'm going to subtitle What It Means to Be an End. Revisiting Kant's philosophy, debate principles commonly allude to the belief that people should be treated as ends and not means to an end. The way people develop desires, interests, and thoughts is through an equal sense of rationality. This rationality also gives us our agency. As such, the product of that rationality, which includes our agency, cannot supersede the product of anyone else's rationality. Therefore, people can't have their rationality or their agency undermined for the achievement of other ends. Everyone's agency is equal because everyone's rationality is equal. So let's talk about this in some debate in specific terms. It's important when you're using this principle in debates to focus on the agency aspect of the principle. It is developed from rationality, but in debating, we'll focus much more on agency as a term. In a motion to implement a national minimum wage, it can be argued that very low wages result in workers laboring for profits enjoyed by employers, which suggests the agency of the workers is undermined for the ends of the employer. Depending on how far you go, you can argue that all work is considered immoral, but in the context of a minimum wage debate, this argument can give a strong principled backing to the implementation of a minimum wage. Basically, workers who aren't being paid enough are being used as a means for the profits and ends of the companies. And so a minimum wage reduces that and therefore gives them more agency. So that's the principle. It's also the case of how decriminalizing sex work would actually provide more agency to sex workers who are free to report violations they encounter and avoid the more dangerous aspects of sex work. The principle here suggests sex workers have more agency when sex work is decriminalized than when it is illegal. This is not a conversation on whether sex work itself is ethical, but rather a claim on the agency of sex workers in this debate, for example. Now, to draw parallels to the drugs debate, this isn't necessarily a debate on the drugs themselves. In this case, we aren't necessarily debating the principles of sex work itself. The principle, rather, is on how we create more agency by decriminalizing sex work. In debating, the most that we can do a lot of the time is simply to improve the agency of people. And usually it's a good idea to move in that direction and to move with a decision that does this. We can't prove that one policy will actualize agency, but we can show that it reduces exploitation and increases agency at least. It's all about being an end. The third principle I'm going to subtitle We Didn't Start the Fight. Karl Marx's conflict theory claimed that society is rife with class antagonisms. The wealthy work to exploit the poor to increase their profits. The poor fight to escape the exploitation of the wealthy. In this case, the wealthy choose to maintain these antagonisms, and the poor are forced to fight back or sacrifice their agency. More so, these antagonisms are inherited. This applies past just. This means that when you're born, you face them. They're inherited, whether you want them to or not. So the principle applies past. This principle also applies past just analysis on class. Postmodern and or feminist writing has largely developed conflict theory to a persecution of various identities who face antagonism. Okay, so let's look at this principle in some debates. This principle is helpful as preemptive or responses to backlash arguments. Certainly, an oppressor does not need to be angered to oppress, and the desire to do so is already particularly pervasive before an action that might anger them. More than this, it suggests that oppression will continue precisely because nothing is done. The antagonism causes the oppression, and the antagonism is started and maintained by the oppressor. If an oppressed group wants their oppression to end, they must end the antagonism. In many debates, there'll be a discussion on which direction a movement can take, and there will be practical arguments made on which direction is most helpful for that group. This is a different discussion to the principle that regardless of what action is taken, there will be antagonism, which is a good principled response to um, backlash arguments. So the very existence of antagonism should likely not be a motivation for non action. If anything, it's a strong principle for explaining the consequences of non action. For example, a motion on implementing a wealth tax could lean heavily on the consequences of not regulating wealth and how that would create class antagonism, which is a principle. This is also why defending the status quo is sometimes a difficult feat in debating. It's likely that situations may organically worsen unless proven otherwise. For example, in a status quo where people are already fighting back, you might not need another very specific measure of fighting back. The fourth principle we're going to look at is what I'm going to call cross the intersections. Kimberly Crenshaw's analysis of Black women in spaces of work expressed how race, gender, and class oppressions, when combined, are unique and severe. This has become one of the most relevant principles in contemporary politics. It also means that measures to address one form of oppression may fail to address broader marginalization because among oppressed groups there are also internal differences of power and oppression. Moreover, without calling attention to this, oppressed people can tend toward being oppressors of more marginalized groups than them. So, the common example, Black men, although facing racial persecution, can also be persecutors of Black women. So, without understanding or exploring intersectionality, you can develop a society where people who face one kind of oppression are develop and are allowed or maintain or perpetuate a different form of oppression. Okay, so that's the simple principle. Clearly, this principle is useful in debates about identity, such as with the transgender movement should separate from the LGBTQI plus movement, debates on gender quotas in government, on legislating equal pay, etc. But the principle is also helpful to look at debates which aren't explicitly about identities. We can apply it in some other contexts. For instance, in the motion, this House would ban political advertising. A proposing team can argue that political candidates with immense financing to run political ads will have an advantage to the campaigns of poorer candidates. That's the first thing. Then they can show that the policies that wealthier candidates tend to support have particular properties, and that the policies that poorer candidates tend to support have particular properties. Maybe they might argue that wealthier candidates are more likely to support policies that are beneficial for employers, for corporations, with poor people are more likely to support policies that are better for workers, as an example. So you're showing an intersection between the identity of the candidate and what kind of policy they're more likely to espouse. But remember, this debate is about political advertising. So you're linking that identity analysis to political advertising by showing that one class identity has more access to political advertising. So you can conclude that allowing political advertising entrenches the policies of wealthier candidates in a society's political consciousness. So you've actually used intersectionality in a debate about banning political adverts. So it's important here to definitely prove the link between wealthier candidates and specific forms of policies. Because if if any candidate will espouse any policy, then the intersectionality wouldn't apply. Another example, in the motion, this House would cut funding to museums. The proposer could argue that regular users of museums tend to be people from middle to upper class incomes who value museums but are disincentivized from contributing to their upkeep because the government is financing them. If they potentially face closure because the government is no longer financing them, these wealthier people would have to invest in them because they are interested in them. So you're showing there's an intersection between wealthy people and museums. Then you're saying if governments stop funding museums, because wealthy people care about museums, they're more likely to themselves fund these museums. So you're using an intersection of identity to further your claim for reducing government funding of museums. But opposition can actually do the same thing. On the other hand, opposition could argue an intersection between wealthier people and the kind of museums they enjoy and the kind of art they would fund. Maybe only very abstract art, maybe art that isn't too critical of wealthy people, for example. In this case, government funded museums ensure that the art in museums is not just based on the interest of the wealthy. So the opposition is also applying intersectionality to show that if museums are only funded by the wealthy, the kind of art in these museums will represent the interests of the wealthy, whereas government funded museums can be more pro working class, pro poor, and not necessarily represent just the wealthy. So both teams here have actually used intersectionality to support their claims. But the debate isn't necessarily about identities, it was a debate about government funding to museums. So there is a way to implement intersectionality outside of just identity politics debates. The fifth principle here is one that I'm going to call a village raises a child, which comes from the popular African proverb that it takes a village to raise a child. Okay, this is going to lean into some African philosophy. Prevailing African philosophy is actually very helpful, but is underused in debating. Communitarian systems tend to value pro social activities as ethical. These are basically activities that help the group, meaning one's contribution to the overall well being of a group is more important than one's individual values. Okay, so the principle here is not about communitarianism. The principle here is that the contribution to a group can be seen as the ethical metric rather than one's personal values. The metric suggests the involvement of a community in co-creating moral judgment. This also means the perceived character of a person is linked to the actions they undertake. And these actions don't necessarily have to benefit the whole group, but certainly having pro-social beliefs is insufficient for achieving moral status, at least under this metric. This suggests, too, that moral assessment is relative to social context. While some actions are permissible in some societies, they are scorned in others because societies form as a group to create values and moral ideas. For example, in some countries, consuming dog meat is illegal. Like legal systems, each community has a unique moral jurisdiction. They can claim to have developed a unique moral code which can be used to judge the actions of members of their community. So there's also, if you look at debate examples, the case for decriminalizing activities on the basis of community values. Importantly, the claim is not to criminalize or decriminalize this activity because it's what the community thinks is bad, and to simply decriminalize what the community thinks is good. Often a community can be misinformed or they can be biased. The claim is to consider that actions that are taken for that community, even if they are unrecognized by the community as beneficial, do afford moral value to those actions. So to phrase it again, an action that is taken for a community has moral value. It doesn't mean that we create moral value on the basis of the perceptions of the community. There's a difference between actions taken for community and what the perceptions of a community are. For instance, there is the case with a debate example for immigration reform in most countries. Migrants certainly contribute immense labor to these countries' economies, which makes them a moral actor relative to that society. So, if we apply the general principle, the fact that migrants are taking pro social actions in that society makes their actions very moral, and that can be a case maybe for granting them citizenship or whatever you're trying to prove relative to migration in the debate. So, we're using the general principle of actions that are being taken that are pro social being moral to perhaps make a principled case for legalizing migrants or giving migrants citizenship. So I hope you see the links. It's not about a community um, has particular beliefs and therefore those beliefs are morality. It's that particular actions can affect one community way different than it can another. And so an action like eating dog meat can be an offense in one society, but it's not an offense in another. And so the very action of eating the dog meat isn't what's legal or illegal or moral or immoral in this context. It doesn't mean that eating dog meat is right or wrong in general, or that if a society scorns eating dog meat, automatically that should be decriminalized or criminalized or whatever. It just might mean that an activist fighting maybe to protect or rescue dogs or whatever in that society is being moral relative to that society. Does that make sense? So like if you're in a society where eating dogs is illegal and you're a person that is trying to prevent the eating of dogs, you are being moral relative to that society because of the actions you're taking. And then maybe you can make an argument for why that means you should be a citizen or whatever, depending on what arguments you're trying to prove. So that's what the principle states. Assessing whether someone is virtuous on the basis of their actions is also a more definite metric. We can say, oh, this is what action someone's doing and this is what action someone's not doing, than their beliefs. This allows for debate on topics such as religion to focus more on the role of religion or religious organizations in their societies as a metric for whether they're a bad actor in the debate. It's important to note that these actors are considered moral or immoral relative to their society. So maybe religious groups might have particular beliefs that we want to consider moral, but a church or a mega church, we might make a case for taxing it because it doesn't do enough to contribute to a community, or whatever analysis we might build about the role that that church plays in that community. We might say that the church takes money away from people in the community. If a lot of poor people are making lots of contributions in terms of money, tithes, offering to that church, we might say that action is actually a bad moral action relative to that poor community because you aren't doing things that help that community. Maybe if that's what you're arguing, at least, in the lens of this argument, at least, and that leads the church acting immoral, and so they should be taxed. So that's a way to use this framework in various debates. Okay, so the sixth one I'm not going to go into now, but it's in the guide. But basically, it's looking into self-evident truths like the right to life, the right to equality, and ways to argue these or to not argue these. But that one you can read about in the notes because there was quite a lengthy section. Okay, so before I continue to the final section of this workshop, which is also the shortest and is on evidence, I'm going to just respond to some of the questions that I've been asked in the internal group chat. So the first question asks, hi, Tshiamo, I have a question. In the Latin American circuits, judges really value engagement and how comparative your case is. Is that a thing in the African circuit? So the African circuit is not as homogeneous as most other circuits in the world. A debater debating in West Africa is most likely to only engage with debaters from Southern Africa once at an annual tournament called the Pan-African Universities Debating Championships, or PANs. Even then, Southern African debaters aren't regular participants in PANs when it's outside of Southern Africa. So, not because of us, there isn't a lot of engagement between African debaters. So, what I found debating, in Africa is that there are different metrics applied in different parts of the continent, and I don't want to be too prescriptive about what those metrics are. Um, but I do think that in Southern Africa, I can say that engagement and how comparative a case is isn't as prioritized as how valuable you make the case. Maybe if you make a very strong appeal in your case, even if you don't do explicit comparative with the other team, simply because your value is shown to be very strong, a judge might credit you above the other team. So showing that your case has more value seems to be more of a metric in judging in the Southern African circuit than doing explicit comparatives and evaluations between teams. But engagement, I think, is very important. In I know that in a lot of cases, there's even explicit penalties for a lack of rebuttal, for example. Um, so I do think the judges in their minds know that engagement is important, but I do think that how arguments are valued, even how they're framed, even if you don't do comparative, tends to be a pervasive trend in the Southern African circuit. The second question that was asked is, on regret motions, does government bench have to present a counterfactual? Oh, this is like definitely one of those very jargonistic terms in debating. And I've seen counterfactual used to actually mean a lot of different things. So if you ask this question, let me just quickly go back to the question asker. Matty, I don't know if you're still connected, but Matty, it would be helpful if you could just maybe just type out for me what your understanding of a counterfactual is so that I answer the question accurately. What I would like to say is three really good things to do in a regret motion. You don't have to do all three of these things. The first one is past analysis, to look at real world how something has developed in the real world. And I've actually got quite a lot of examples of this in my document here. Oh, I think I only have one. Sorry, I've got one example of that in my document. But basically, to look at how things happened in the past and to show how its development in the past is regrettable. You can link this eventually to trends, um, how its existence in the past might escalate, worsen, or continue. So doing a lot of past analysis can be helpful for regret motions. Secondly, and I think the most and obvious one is impact, how it's affected particular actors, maybe how it's harmed marginalized groups, restricted access to resources, etc. So a lot of regret motions look at how a particular thing has been harmful. Okay, so the first one is to look at how it has developed in the past. The second one, in the regret motion, gets maybe just to look at how something has been harmed. The third one, and maybe this is what you mean by counterfactual, is to show how it has prevented a different world. Like, because we chose this option, we can't choose a different option. Because I turned left, I can't turn right. I don't know if that's what you mean by counterfactual, but oh yes, now that you've just explained it in the comment thread, yes, that we do understand counterfactual to mean exactly the same thing. That if I had not turned left, I would have turned right, and this is what the world would have looked like. And yes, that's the third, I think, primary way that people have looked at regrets motions. And personally, I think it's the difficulty with that one is it's less grounded in very material, realistic things that we can observe, like the first one, which is the past, which has happened, which is observable and known. The second, which is harms to groups, which is observable and known. The third one on what the world might look like is very difficult to achieve because it's very substantial. You can't base it on past trends. What do you base it on? However, I still think it's a relevant debate to have. it can become very abstract, and I don't know what metric lots of judges will use to adjudicate counterfactuals. But here's an example. We had a motion in the Southern African circuit about time. Oof, okay, I just forget the phrasing, but it's something relative to time travel. Um, yes, I just remember the motion. The motion was about making people in the past have equal rights. Okay, no, just give me a moment. I remember that this motion did come down to a counterfactual. Okay, I can't remember the motion, but let me describe the counterfactual that came up in our case. We argued that if time travel did exist, people might use this time travel to solve major social issues. Okay, so people might go back into the past to try and solve big issues and important issues that the world might face. And so, I just remembered the motion. Wait, sorry for that confusion for a moment. This happens. The motion was creating a time machine device, but not using it. Or if time machine existed, this house would not travel in time. Okay, that was the motion. It was the semi-final of the Southern African Universities Debates Championships in 2017. We were opening our position. Okay, so we argued that just like right now, we have an obligation to help other people. We have an obligation to help other people who are sick, who need help. We similarly have an obligation to help people in the past that don't have cures for diseases, that suffer, that have low life expectancy, that face a myriad of problems that we no longer face because of our advancements in technology. And so we should use time travel to go back into the past and help these people. More than this, I think we'd expect people from the distant future to come back into our timeline and show us things that we don't yet know. With that analysis, I went on to try and explore some of the things that people in the future might be able to give us. I argue that people in the future might have figured out a way to allow humans to fly. Maybe we figure out a way to translate feelings into speech. So there's no way to describe the color red. I might be able to tell you that it's a warm color, but I cannot literally give you words that make you see red. Maybe in the distant future, they find the correct combination of words or phonetic sounds to elicit the sight of colors, for example. And in my speech, I went on a list of all of these futuristic things that people from the future might give to us. And I used that to say, wouldn't we want these things? Similarly, we should go back into the past and give what we have to the people who are stuck in the past. A lot of this analysis was dependent on esoteric analysis of the future, which I don't know and is uncertain, and there's no way to argue that it's true. But it was really effective in this debate because what I was actually trying to show was to show that we want people in the future to bring their cool stuff back for us, regardless of what cool stuff that is. So my recommendation is to not focus too much on the specifics. Like the future is going to have this. That an alternative timeline will definitely look specific like this. But maybe to be more general about that specific timeline. Like an African continent without slavery might have a lot of communitarian principles. It doesn't help to go into specifics about how advanced today technology would be. That becomes a very esoteric debate about how technology is developed, etc. But in a debate about how Africa might be communitarian, I think it was a lot easier than a debate about what their technology would specifically look like. So if you are going to do a counterfactual, it helps to be more general. Do give specific examples, obviously, but make it clear that these specific examples can be other specific examples of equal weight, but apply to the general idea. Like if it's this house regrets slavery in Africa, maybe a general principle is that Africans are communitarian. You might say that we share resources, In the continent, um, you might say there's more equality. You might say that we figured out a way to develop anarchist or decentralized modes of governance, you know, and that very specific example might not be true, the anarchist decentralized modes of governance. But the general point you're making is that communitarianism would be a prevailing mode of thought, and that there are many different ways that this can take form. Obviously, and you're just giving some of the examples. Another thing is if you consider things like the butterfly effect, where one small thing can affect a large chain of results, it's quite obvious that even small things can affect the future in so many numerous ways. But if you focus on general principles, you minimize the butterfly effect. The butterfly effect is more pervasive for specific things. So even if you are using specific things, make it clear that you're using these specific things to prove more general ideas. And that even if the specific things were specifically different, the general thing would still be consistent. So I think that's how I recommend doing a counterfactual in a regret motion. I hope that answers your question. You can ask me if you want more clarification of what I mean. Okay, I'm going to go into the last section now. Let me just quickly check if there are any other questions that were perhaps sent to me on WhatsApp or anywhere else. Probably should have done that whilst I was explaining the counterfactual thing. Okay, it seems no other questions for the time being. So let's do to the last section before we close off this. I know this has been a bit of a long workshop for some of you, but thank you for holding on and for still being here. Okay, so this final section is on evidence or examples. We've all been there. It's happened to all of us. You hear the motion and realize that you know very little about the subject. This section can't help you figure out what to argue, but once you do have an argument, coming up with some examples might be a bit easier than you think. Examples are meant to augment arguments. So if you have many good ideas, so if you don't have many good ideas in the first place, creative examples can't help much. So it's important that you do come up with good arguments, right? And those good arguments can be augmented by examples, but the advice I'm going to give you here isn't going to help you create good arguments. As long as you know what you want to communicate, the goal of your evidence is just to emphasize your arguments. You can even just use general knowledge to do this. And by general knowledge, I literally mean general knowledge. What do? We all have a lot of information about some things. The issue is finding information that communicates our argument in a debate. Many debates are about very specific motions, and the use of evidence is especially heavy in debates such as debates about international relations, for example. If you have little knowledge on this subject, like international relations, it may be difficult to give coherent examples that assist your case. But although the debate may be very specific, arguments tend to be very broad, and many general examples can still communicate effectively the idea that you are trying to raise. Okay, the information doesn't even need to be exact to be effective. For instance, let's consider a motion that's about Black culture, maybe about cultural appropriation. Here's an example or evidence that you might use in your debate. Let's say you don't have any examples, which is strange for this debate, but let's just assume. As thousands marched the streets of France in grand revolution against the terror of tyranny in the 18th century, a much more neglected group of Haitian revolutionaries also marched their streets. But for all their efforts, there was no glory, no history, and even today, little recognition. Centuries later, the role of dominant white culture is still to neglect, overshadow, and rewrite the efforts of Black people who must become new revolutionaries in a cultural war. So I used the example of the French Revolution and the Haitian Revolution in the debate about appropriation of Black culture. You see, and I mean, there is some rhetoric in there and emphasis, but I've used deliberately overemphasized examples in this. So it's been overemphasized, but it shows that the argument here obviously is that maybe in this context, um, dominant culture overshadows marginalized culture. But I've used the example of how the French Revolution overshadowed the Haitian Revolution to just draw in that sort of comparison. Even if uh, even if the Haitian Revolution isn't about culture, if that makes sense. In the previous case, okay, we obviously could have also just argued about white artists who make art for black audiences, given some examples of that. White celebrities who tan their bodies to appear darker, some examples of that. These are relevant and useful, and you probably should do that. And they help cement the existence of, real world examples into black culture. But the argument about rewriting that culture is still effective with a niche historical example. And also, my advice here is mostly for when you really can't come up with other examples. It's not mostly for instances where there are clear and obvious examples that you can use. Creativity is important here, and it's definitely easy to get this wrong. Also, if you already have ample real examples that help your case, I still recommend using those ones. But if you know nothing about cryptocurrency, for example, and you're in a debate about mainstreaming the use of cryptocurrency, maybe you can say something like this: we have trusted digital technology to manage almost every part of our lives. Some people live in houses where their furniture communicates. Our banking is online. Our business is online. We've transcribed our thoughts into status updates and smiles into image macros. There are entire ecosystems and communities basically living off the internet, and people around the world have been developing this world. It's time we gave it a currency. So here I've actually used examples of like the Internet of Things where people have technology that communicates with each other to make a general point about technology in our lives, to value it. And cryptocurrency is a digital currency, so I can link it to digital things in that sense. Even without knowing much about cryptocurrency, this evidence is still helpful. Now remember, this doesn't replace arguments about cryptocurrency and why it should be implemented. So if you're unable to come up with arguments for cryptocurrency or against it, just saying these words isn't going to help you. It's just going to be rhetoric. This is to augment arguments that you have already made. If you can't come up with examples, like, do you have real world examples of how cryptocurrency has helped people? Maybe not off the slip of your tongue. So maybe you do know about cryptocurrency, but you couldn't just think of a real world example. So you've made your argument about why we should adopt cryptocurrency, and then you say this part, which is just an example that just overemphasizes the argument that you also need to make. The point here is to always refer to what your team is trying to prove and find ways to incorporate general knowledge into evidence for your claims. Another example on aggressive environmental activism against governments. That's what I'm going to give you now. When a member of the United States Congress threw a shoe at George Bush, we should have known that the time for respectability politics was over. Now, even more than then, political leaders pass policies which endanger our collective well being as we try to address a global threat to our climate and futures. We need to be aggressive if we're going to be heard, and this time, our shoe needs to hit its target. It's really effective. I mean, I'm sure we all know about George Bush having a shoe thrown at him. So I might not have examples of aggressive actions taken against the government or aggressive lobbying, but I might remember that one time George Bush had a shoe thrown against him. So I have to find a way to incorporate this evidence and make it relevant by wrapping it into what is like some form of rhetoric, but it makes the example still relevant to the debate without making it seem like, why are you talking about George Bush being thrown with the shoe in a debate about environmental activism? So you don't need examples of environmental activism to make the case that respectability politics should be ended, as an example. It's all about creating sensible scenarios or stories which help emphasize your team's case using examples which are drawn from general knowledge. So here, I think the important thing is to just be a bit creative. Try also to remember what you can. Um, this may What you can remember might be enough to kind of satisfy your team's arguments without giving all the very specific details. I didn't know everything about the George Bush case. I didn't know everything about the Haitian and French revolutions, but I was still able to use those as examples in those two specific debates without necessarily mentioning the specifics about these general knowledge claims. But also try to remember as much as you can about the real subject matter, like cryptocurrency, for instance. Try to be calm and remember whatever you can about the topic. Anything that helps that's relative to the motion can simply be wrapped in rhetoric-like statements that help you develop your evidence. All you need to do is find a way to mention this evidence in a way that makes sense. For example, in a debate about torture, you might remember that the US has a torture scandal. You might not know where or what its name is, but since we all know about Guantanamo Bay in Cuba, it might not be necessary for you to give the name. Or we all know generally about this. Just referring to the US as terrorism might be enough. People will know what you're referring to. In fact, you don't want to be using too specialist examples because they might not have the same value as general knowledge examples. Widely known examples are better for debates because they're familiar and don't have to be fully explained. But if you're going to mention obscure examples, that's still okay. What evidence you use is entirely up to you. I can't state this enough. Even seemingly unrelated events um, that exist in general knowledge can be useful for your case. Debating is about engaging reasonable ideas, not listing facts. A team does not win for listing or knowing more. It's all about how that evidence is used to reinforce the ideas that are presented in their arguments. Okay, so that's all I have for you. A quick summary to go over everything. 4 burdens. Does it apply to this debate? Are you accurate? Are you saying things the right way? Is your matter important? Have you shown that it's valuable? Have you shown how you're building your arguments in valid structures so that it's not easily exploitable? Effectively, does your conclusion follow? That was the first section. The second section was looking at some principles. It was looking at, can you universalize things to create a law? Secondly, how do we increase agency debates? Thirdly, why we must fight back and non-action might further oppression. Fourth was to look at intersections and the role of identity in debate. Uh, Finally, we looked at community morals in debating. Um, the sixth one I just brushed on was that it is going to be my booklet about debating more self-evident principle. Then the final section was about how we can use examples, even if we don't know much about the debate in terms of examples, but we do still need to develop coherent arguments using general knowledge and trying your best to be creative, remember what you can, and simply emphasize your argument. Thank you, everyone. The booklet will be shared widely to everyone who's involved in the tournament. I'll also make sure that it's shared widely. It's called the SEMA, SEMA, that means Speak in Kiswahili, SEMA Speaker Training Booklet. I'm Tshiamo Malatji. I'm so thankful for the opportunity to be on the CA team for this tournament. I look forward to seeing a lot of strong debates. If you have any other questions between now and the start of the tournament, please feel free to contact me. I'm on the WhatsApp groups for both the teams and judges. You can just find me there and ask me questions, especially about this content. I know this was a lengthy presentation at 1 hour and 30 minutes, but hopefully it was helpful. Thank you so much, and goodbye to everyone.
Okay, Tshiamo, thank you a lot for your presentation. Thank you a lot for your workshop. Were very, very, very interesting and full of concepts. I imagine that Latin American circuit debate is going to learn a lot of you. Thank you to make this for the tournament. We wait see you in the debates and in the finals. And in the adjudication, we will see what do you have prepared for us in the motions.
Oh, yeah,
So thank you to be here, Tshiamo, and with that we close the retransmitted the direct. But not without regard the people subscribe the channel to see the rest of the debates and the rest of workshops from our super CA team. So thank you a lot, everyone, and see you in the next.